Namaste, Dandavat Pranam. By the instruction and grace of our spiritual master, Om Vishnupad, Paramahamsa Sripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj, we're here reading Srimad Bhagavatam, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Canto 3, the Status Quo, Chapter 28, Text 36. Stopyetaya charamaya manaso nivritya tasmin mahimya vishita shuka dukkha baye etubham apyasati kartari dukhayoryat svatman vidhata upalabda paratma kasta. Thus situated in the highest transcendental stage, the mind ceases from all material reaction and becomes situated in its own glory, transcendental to all material conceptions of happiness and distress. At that time, the yogi realizes the truth of his relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He discovers that pleasure and pain, as well as their interactions, which he attributed to his own self, are actually due to the false ego, which is a product of ignorance. Purport. Forgetfulness of one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a product of ignorance. By yoga practice, one can eradicate this ignorance of self. One can eradicate this ignorance of thinking oneself independent of the Supreme Lord. One's actual relationship is eternally that of love. The living entity is meant to render transcendental loving service to the Lord. Forgetfulness of that sweet relationship is called ignorance. And in ignorance, one is impelled by the three material modes of nature to think himself the enjoyer. When the devotee's mind is purified and he understands that his mind has to be dovetailed with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he has attained the perfectional transcendental stage, which is beyond the perception of material distress and happiness. As long as one acts on his own account, he is subject to all the material perceptions of so-called happiness and distress. Actually, there is no happiness. Just as there is no happiness in any of the activities of a madman, so in material activities, the mental concoctions of happiness and distress are false. Actually, everything is distress. When the mind is dovetailed to act according to the desire of the Lord, one has attained the transcendental stage. The desire to lord it over material nature is the cause of ignorance. And when that desire is completely extinguished, and the desires are dovetailed with those of the Supreme Lord, one has reached the perfectional stage. Upalabdha Paramatma Kasta. Upalabdha means realization. Realization necessarily indicates individuality. In the perfectional liberated stage, there is actual realization. Nivritya means that the living entity keeps his individuality. Oneness means that he realizes happiness in the happiness of the Supreme Lord. In the Supreme Lord, there is nothing but happiness. Anandamayo Vyasat. The Lord is by nature full of transcendental happiness. In the liberated stage, oneness with the Supreme Lord means that one has no realization other than happiness. But the individual still exists. Otherwise, this word upalabdha, indicating individual realization of transcendental happiness, would not have been used. Text 37. Deham chetam na charama stitam uhitam va Siddho vipasyati yato jagamatvarupam daivadupetam attadaiva vasadapitam vasoyata parikritam madhiramadhanha. Because he has achieved his real identity, the perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting, just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. Purport. This stage of life is explained by Rupa Goswami and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. A person whose mind is completely dovetailed with the desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and who engages 100% in the service of the Lord forgets his material bodily demands. Text 38. Deho pidhaiva vasagha kalu karma yavat swarambhakam pratisamikshata iva shasu tam sva prapancham adi rudha samadhi yoga swapnam punarna bhajate prati buddha vastu. The body of such a liberated yogi, along with the senses, is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and it functions until its destined activities are finished. The liberated devotee, being awake to his constitutional position, and thus situated in samadhi, the highest perfectional stage of yoga, does not accept the byproducts of the material body as his own. Thus he considers his bodily activities to be like the activities of a body in a dream. Purport. The following questions may be posed. As long as the liberated soul is in contact with the body, why don't the bodily activities affect him? Doesn't he actually become contaminated by the action and reaction of material activities? In answer to such questions, this verse explains that the material body of a liberated soul is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is not acting due to the living force of the living entity. It is simply acting as a reaction to past activities. Even after being switched off, an electric fan moves for some time. That movement is not due to the electric current, but it is a continuation of the last movement. Similarly, although a liberated soul appears to be acting just like an ordinary man, his actions are to be accepted as the continuation of past activities. In a dream, one may see himself expanded through many bodies, but when awake, he can understand that those bodies were all false. Similarly, although a liberated soul has the byproducts of the body, children, wife, house, etc., he does not identify himself with those bodily expansions. He knows that they are all products of the material dream. The gross body is made of the gross elements of matter, and the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. If one can accept the subtle body of a dream as false and not identify oneself with that body, then certainly an awake person need not identify with the gross body. As one who is awake has no connection with the activities of the body in a dream, an awakened, liberated soul has no connection with the activities of the present body. In other words, because he is acquainted with his constitutional position, he never accepts the bodily concept of life. Text 39. Yata putraksha vitachcha pratamartya pratiyate apyatmat vena vimatad dehade purushastata. Because of great affection for family and wealth, one accepts a son and some money as his own. And due to affection for the material body, one thinks that it is his. But actually, as one can understand that his family and wealth are different from him, the liberated soul can understand that he and his body are not the same. Purport. The status of real knowledge is explained in this verse. There are many children, but we accept some children as our sons and daughters because of our affection for them, although we know very well that these children are different from us. Similarly, because of great affection for money, we accept some amount of wealth in the bank as ours. In the same way, we claim that the body is ours because of attention for it, because of affection for it. I say that it is my body, and then extend that possessive concept to say, it is my hand, my leg. And further, it is my bank balance, my son, my daughter. But actually, I know that the son and the money are separate from me. It is the same with the body. I am separate from my body. It is a question of understanding, and the proper understanding is called pratibuddha. By obtaining knowledge in the devotional service or Krishna consciousness, one can become a liberated soul. Text 40. Yatol mukad vishvulingad dumad vapisva sambhavat apyatmat vena bhimatad yatagni pritag ulmukat. The blazing fire is different from the flames, from the sparks, and from the smoke, although all are intimately connected, because they are born from the same blazing wood. Purport. Although the blazing firewood, the sparks, the smoke, and the flame cannot stay apart. Although the blazing firewood, the sparks, the smoke, and the flame cannot stay apart because each of them is part and parcel of the fire, still they are different from one another. A less intelligent person accepts the smoke as fire, although fire and smoke are completely different. The heat and light of the fire are separate, although one cannot differentiate fire from heat and light. Text 41. Utendriyanta karanat pradhanaj jiva samgitat atmatata pratagrasta bhagavan brahma samgita. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is known as Param Brahma, is the seer. He is different from the jiva soul, or the living entity, the individual living entity, who is combined with the senses, the five elements, and consciousness. Purport. A clear conception of the complete whole is given herewith. The living entity is different from the material elements and the supreme living entity. The personality of Godhead, who is the creator of the material elements, is also different from the individual living entity. This philosophy is propounded by Lord Chaitanya as a Chintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. Everything is simultaneously one with and different from everything else. The cosmic manifestation created by the Supreme Lord, by his material energy, is also simultaneously different and non-different from him. The material energy is non-different from the Supreme Lord, but at the same time, because that energy is acting in a different way, it is different from him. Similarly, the individual living entity is one with and different from the Supreme Lord. This simultaneous one and different philosophy is the perfect conclusion of the Bhagavat school, as confirmed here by Kapilas. Living entities are compared to sparks of fire. As stated in the previous verse, fire, flame, smoke, and firewood are combined together. Here, the living entity, the material elements, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are combined together. The exact position of the living entities is just like the sparks of fire. They are part and parcel. The material energy is compared to the smoke. The fire is also part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. In the Vishnu Purana, it is said that whatever we can see or experience, either in the material or spiritual world, is an expansion of the different energies of the Supreme Lord. As fire distributes its light and heat from one place, the Supreme Personality of Godhead distributes its different energies all over creation. The four principles of Vaishnava philosophic doctrine are Shuddha Advaita, purified oneness, Dvaita Advaita, simultaneous oneness and difference, Vishishta Advaita, and Dvaita. All four principles of Vaishnava philosophy are based on the thesis of Srimad Bhagavatam, explained in these two verses. Text 42. Sarva bhuteshu chatmanam, sarva bhutani chatmani, ikshetanhanya bhavena, bhutesvibhatad atmatam. A yogi should see the same soul in all manifestations, for all that exists is a manifestation of different energies of the Supreme. In this way, the devotee should see all living entities without distinction. That is the realization of the Supreme Soul. Purport. As stated in Brahma Samhita, not only does the Supreme Soul enter each and every universe, but he enters even the atoms. The Supreme Soul is present everywhere in the dormant stage, and when one can see the presence of the Supreme Soul everywhere, one is liberated from material designations. The word sarva bhuteshu is to be understood as follows. There are 4 different divisions of species: living entities which sprout from the earth, living entities born of fermentation or germination, living entities which come from eggs, and living entities which come from the embryo. These 4 divisions of living entities are expanded in 8,400,000 species of life. A person who is freed from material designations can see the same quality of spirit present everywhere or in every manifested living entity. Less intelligent men think that plants and grass grow out of the earth automatically, but one who is actually intelligent and has realized the self can see that this growth is not automatic. The cause is the soul, and the forms come out in material bodies under different conditions. By fermentation in the laboratory, many germs are born, but this is due to the presence of the soul. Material scientist thinks that the eggs are lifeless, but that is not a fact. From Vedic scripture, we can understand that living entities in different forms are generated under different conditions. Birds evolve from eggs, beasts and human beings are born from the embryo. The perfect vision of a yogi or devotee is that he sees the presence of the living entity everywhere. Text 43. Svayonishu yata jyotir ekam nanha pratiyate yoninam guna vaishamyat tatatma prakritostita. As fire is exhibited in different forms of wood, so under different conditions of the modes of material nature, the pure spirit soul manifests itself in different bodies. Purport. It has to be understood that the body is designated. Prakriti is an interaction by 3 modes of material nature, and according to these modes, someone has a small body and someone has a very large body. For example, the fire in a big piece of wood appears very big, and in a stick, the fire appears small. Actually, the quality of fire is the same everywhere, but the manifestation of the material nature is such that according to the fuel, the fire appears bigger or smaller. Similarly, the soul in the universal body, although of the same quality, is different from the soul in the smaller body. The small particles of soul are just like sparks of the larger soul. The greatest soul is the super soul, but the super soul is quantitatively different from the small soul. The super soul is described in Vedic literature as the supplier of all necessities of the smaller soul, Nityo Nityanam. One who understands this distinction between the super soul and the individual soul is above lamentation and is in a peaceful position. When the smaller soul thinks himself quantitatively as big as the larger soul, he is under the spell of Maya, for that is not his constitutional position. No one can become the greater soul simply by mental speculation. The smallness or greatness of different souls is described in the Varaha Purana as Svamsa Vibhinamsa. The Svamsa soul is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the Vibhinamsa souls, or small particles, are eternally small particles, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Amayabhamso jiva loke jiva batu sanatana. The small living entities are eternally part and parcel, and therefore it is not possible for them to be quantitatively as great as the super soul. text 44. This is the last verse of this chapter. So we'll finish reading this. You just have to go check on something. I'll be right back. Text 44. Tasmad imam svam prakritim daivim sad asad atmikam dorvi bhavyam parabhavya svarupena vatistate. Thus the yogi can be in the self-realized position after conquering the insurmountable spell of Maya, who presents herself as both the cause and effect of this material manifestation, and is therefore very difficult to understand. Purport. It is stated in Bhagavad Gita that the spell of Maya, which covers the knowledge of a living entity, is insurmountable. However, one who surrenders unto Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, can conquer this seemingly insurmountable spell of Maya. Here also it is stated that the Daivi Prakriti, or the external energy of the Supreme Lord, is Dorvi Bhavya, very difficult to understand and very difficult to conquer. One must, however, conquer this insurmountable spell of Maya, and this is possible by the grace of the Lord, when God reveals himself to the surrendered soul. It is also stated here, Srupena Vitistate. Svarupa means that one has to know that he is not the Supreme Soul, but rather part and parcel of the Supreme Soul. That is self-realization. To think falsely that one is the Supreme Soul and that one is all-pervading, is not Svarupa. This is not realization of his actual position. The real position is that one is part and parcel. It is recommended here that one remain in that position of actual self-realization. In Bhagavad Gita, this understanding is defined as Brahman realization. After Brahman realization, one can engage in activities of Brahman. As long as one is not self-realized, he engages in activities based on false identification with the body. When one is situated in his real self, then the activities of Brahman realization begin. The Mayavad philosophers say that after Brahman realization, all activities stop, but that is not actually so. If the soul is so active in its abnormal condition, existing under the covering of matter, how can one deny its activity when free? An example may be cited here. If a man in a diseased condition is very active, how can one imagine that when he is free from these diseases, he will be inactive? Naturally, the conclusion is that when one is free from all disease, his activities are pure. It may be said that the activities of Brahman realization are different from those of conditional life. That does not stop activity. This is indicated in Bhagavad Gita 18.54. After one realizes oneself to be Brahman, devotional service begins. Mad bhaktim labate param. After Brahman realization, one can engage in the devotional service of the Lord. Therefore, devotional service of the Lord is activity in Brahman realization. For those who engage in devotional service, there is no spell of Maya, and their situation is all perfect. The duty of the living entity as part and parcel of the whole is to render devotional service to the whole. That is the ultimate perfection of life. Thus end the Bhaktivedanta purports of the 3rd canto, 28th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Lord Kapila's Instructions on the Execution of Devotional Service. And thus ends our reading for today. We will continue from chapter 29, Explanation of Devotional Service by Lord Kapila, on Wednesday. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Sripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Srila Guru Maharaj, Srila Guru Dev, Srila Acharya Dev, Srila Shanta Maharaj Ki Jai.
Jai.
Jai Rupanuga Guru Varga Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the worldwide devotees. Sama Bhaktivedanta Vrinda Ki Jai.
Jai.
Jai Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. Nishangapali Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai. Baladev Subhadra Jagannath Ju Ki Jai. Gangamai Yamuna Mai Ki Jai. Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Giri Govardhan Govardhan Dham Ki Jai. Sham Kund Radha Kund Ki Jai. Tulsi Bhakti Devi Vrinda Devi Ki Jai. Jai Harinam Sankirtan Yagi Ki Jai. Scientific Sankirtan Yagi Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Jai Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute Ki Jai. Shri Chaitanya Saraswat Institute Ki Jai. Shri Chaitanya Saraswat Mat Ki Jai. Nitya Gaur Premanandi Hari Hari Hari.
Hari Hari Bol.
Jai Shrimati Uma Devi Dasi Ki Jai. Hare Krishna.
Sripad Krishna Keshav Prabhuji ki jai. Dandavad Pranam Prabhuji.